A K-9 refused to leave a locked warehouse. What he found saved 20 lives. The cold night air wrapped around Officer Dan like a cloak as he stood next to his patrol car, watching the moonlight reflect off the warehouse's corrugated metal walls. It was supposed to be a quiet night, just a routine patrol through the industrial district. But Shadow, his loyal K-9 partner, had other ideas. The dog's ears perked up, his sharp eyes locked on the warehouse ahead. Without hesitation, Shadow let out a low growl, the kind that sent a chill down Dan's spine. He knew that sound all too well. It meant something was wrong. Dan knelt down beside the dog, placing a hand on his head. "What is it, boy?" he whispered. Shadow's body tensed, his muscles coiled like a spring ready to explode. He barked again, louder this time, and tugged at the leash, straining toward the warehouse. Dan's instincts kicked in. He had learned to trust Shadow's judgment, and the dog had never been wrong before. All right, Dan said, grabbing the flashlight from his belt. The beam of light cut through the darkness as he scanned the building's exterior. At first glance, everything seemed normal, just another old warehouse, abandoned and forgotten. But Shadow wasn't convinced. He pulled harder on the leash, practically dragging Dan toward the entrance. "Easy, boy," Dan muttered, his pulse quickening. He glanced around, looking for any sign of trouble. The air was thick with silence, broken only by the distant hum of traffic. Still, something felt off. Shadow barked again, his nose pressed against the warehouse door, sniffing furiously. Dan sighed. "Looks like you're not giving up, huh?" He reached for his radio. "Dispatch, this is Officer Dan. I'm at the old Riverside warehouse. My K-9 is acting strange. Requesting backup to investigate." The radio crackled to life. "Copy that, Officer Dan. Sending backup now." Dan clipped the radio back onto his belt and looked down at Shadow. "Guess we'll take a look while we wait, huh?" He pushed the warehouse door, but it didn't budge. Locked. He frowned and gave it another shove. Still nothing. Shadow let out an impatient whine, pawing at the ground. "All right, I get it. You're the boss," Dan said with a chuckle, trying to mask his unease. He circled the building, shining his flashlight into the windows. Most were boarded up, but one at the far end of the warehouse was partially open. Dan climbed up, peering inside. The warehouse was dark and cavernous, filled with stacks of old crates and rusted machinery. Shadows danced across the walls, giving the place an eerie, almost haunted feel. Dan's breath fogged in the cold air as he strained to see further. Nothing seemed out of place, yet his gut told him otherwise. Shadow barked again, this time with more urgency. Dan climbed down and returned to the main entrance. He could feel the tension radiating from the dog, his eyes wide and alert. "Hang on, buddy. Help's on the way." Minutes felt like hours as Dan waited. His mind raced with possibilities. Maybe it was a raccoon or some other animal that had gotten inside. But deep down, he knew it was more than that. Shadow wouldn't react like this for no reason. Finally, the sound of approaching sirens broke the silence. A second patrol car pulled up, and two officers stepped out. Officer Ramirez and Officer Scott, both seasoned veterans, joined Dan at the entrance. "What's going on?" Ramirez asked, eyeing the warehouse. "Shadow's been acting strange," Dan explained. "He's convinced there's something in there." Ramirez raised an eyebrow. "In a place like this? Could be anything. Rats, maybe." Dan shook his head. "It's not rats. Trust me." Scott sighed, adjusting his flashlight. "All right, let's take a look." The officers worked together to force open the door. It groaned in protest, the sound echoing through the empty streets. Shadow darted inside the moment the gap was wide enough, his paws barely touching the ground as he raced ahead. "Shadow, wait," Dan called, but the dog was already gone, disappearing into the shadows. Dan cursed under his breath and followed, his flashlight slicing through the darkness. The other officers trailed behind, their footsteps echoing in the vast space. The air inside was thick with dust, the smell of rust and decay hanging heavy. Shadow's barks echoed off the walls, leading them deeper into the warehouse. Dan's heart pounded in his chest as he tried to keep up. "Shadow, where are you, boy?" he called, his voice bouncing back at him from every direction. A sudden crash made all 3 officers freeze. The sound came from somewhere up ahead, followed by frantic barking. Dan's grip tightened on the flashlight as he moved toward the noise, his pulse hammering in his ears. Shadow stood at the end of a long hallway, his body rigid, his eyes fixed on a large metal door. He barked again, pawing at the door, his nails scratching against the metal. "What the hell's behind there?" Ramirez muttered, stepping closer. Dan's stomach churned. "I don't know, but we're about to find out." Scott tested the handle, but it wouldn't budge. Locked. Figures. Dan scanned the area, his flashlight catching a set of keys hanging on the wall. He grabbed them and tried each one until he found the right fit. The lock clicked open with a dull thud. The door creaked as it swung open, revealing darkness beyond. Dan's flashlight barely penetrated the gloom, but what little it illuminated made his blood run cold. 20 faces stared back at him, eyes wide with fear. For a moment, no one moved. The warehouse was filled with a heavy, oppressive silence, the kind that made every breath feel thick and heavy. Dan's flashlight trembled slightly in his hand as he scanned the terrified faces before him. 20 people, men, women, and even a few children, huddled together in the far corner of the room, their expressions a mix of exhaustion, confusion, and sheer panic. Dan stepped inside cautiously, his eyes darting around the dark space. Shadow remained by his side, his body tense but calm now, his job done. Dan could almost feel the pride radiating from his partner. "It's okay," Dan said, keeping his voice steady and calm. "You're safe now. We're here to help." The crowd remained frozen, their eyes locked on the officers. It was only when one of the women, her face pale and streaked with tears, staggered forward that the spell was broken. "Please, help us," she whispered, her voice cracking. Dan nodded, motioning for Ramirez and Scott to assist. "We're getting you all out of here. Can anyone tell me what happened?" The woman shook her head, trembling. "We were trapped for hours. No one knew we were here. We thought no one was coming." Dan's stomach twisted at her words. If it hadn't been for Shadow's relentless instincts, these people might never have been found. He glanced back at his dog, giving him a quick scratch behind the ears. "Good boy," he murmured. Ramirez stepped forward, his voice firm but reassuring. "All right, folks, listen up. We're gonna get you out one by one. Just stay calm and follow our lead." The group began to stir, murmurs of relief rippling through them. Some clung to each other for support, while others struggled to stand on shaky legs. Dan could see the toll the ordeal had taken on them. Hollow eyes, sweat-soaked clothes, and trembling hands. One of the younger men, barely out of his teens, leaned heavily against the wall, clutching his ribs. How did you find us?" he asked, his voice barely audible. Dan glanced down at Shadow, a faint smile tugging at the corner of his mouth. "You can thank him," he said, gesturing to the dog. "Shadow wouldn't let us leave until we found you." The young man's eyes flicked to Shadow, a flicker of gratitude breaking through the exhaustion on his face. "A dog? Saved us?" "Yeah," Dan said, kneeling down beside him. "He's got a nose for trouble, and he never gives up." Shadow wagged his tail gently, sensing the tension easing in the room. As the officers helped the group toward the warehouse exit, Dan couldn't shake the feeling that they had been incredibly lucky. A few minutes more, and this could have turned into a disaster. His thoughts were interrupted when a little girl tugged at his sleeve. She couldn't have been more than 6, her face streaked with dirt, and her dark curls tangled around her face. "Thank you," she whispered, her voice barely more than a breath. Dan felt his throat tighten. He crouched down to her level, brushing a strand of hair from her face. "You're welcome, sweetheart. You're going to be okay now." The little girl nodded and looked at Shadow, her eyes wide with wonder. "Is he a superhero?" Dan chuckled softly. "He's the closest thing we've got." They finally reached the open air, where flashing lights from emergency vehicles bathed the scene in a surreal glow. Paramedics rushed forward, wrapping blankets around the survivors and checking them for signs of dehydration and injury. Dan watched the scene unfold, relief washing over him like a wave. But as he scanned the crowd, his attention was drawn back to the little girl and her mother, who clung to each other as a paramedic checked their vitals. For a moment, Dan saw himself in the girl's eyes, a glimpse of innocence that had come far too close to being lost forever. Shadow sat beside him, his eyes scanning the scene as if making sure everyone was truly safe. Dan patted his head again, his voice low. "You saved them, boy. You did that." A news van rolled up to the scene, reporters spilling out with cameras and microphones in hand. Dan sighed, bracing himself for the onslaught of questions. He wasn't one for the spotlight, but he knew they would want to hear the story. Sure enough, a reporter made a beeline for him, her microphone already raised. "Officer Dan, can you tell us what happened here tonight?" Dan hesitated for a moment before nodding. "It wasn't me," he said simply, his hand resting on Shadow's back. "It was him. Shadow wouldn't leave until we found those people. If it weren't for him, this could have ended very differently." The reporter's eyes lit up, sensing a headline-worthy story. "A true hero dog," she exclaimed, her cameraman zooming in on Shadow. Shadow tilted his head slightly, his tongue lolling out in what almost looked like a smile. As the interviews continued, Dan found himself reflecting on the events of the night. He had always known that Shadow was special, but tonight had proven just how extraordinary his partner truly was. Later, as the crowd began to disperse and the last of the survivors were taken to the hospital, Dan sat on the back step of his patrol car, his exhaustion finally catching up with him. Shadow lay at his feet, his head resting on Dan's boot. "You never give up, do you?" Dan said softly, running a hand through Shadow's fur. "Not that I'm complaining. You did good, buddy. Real good." Shadow wagged his tail, his eyes half closed in contentment. The adrenaline from the night's events slowly began to fade, replaced by a deep weariness that settled into Dan's bones. The soft hum of conversations drifted around him as paramedics finished their assessments and officers coordinated statements with survivors. Despite the chaos that still lingered in the air, a strange calm had taken hold. Dan leaned back against the patrol car, eyes fixed on the scene in front of him. The little girl he'd spoken to earlier sat wrapped in a heavy blanket, cradled in her mother's arms. She looked up every few seconds, her eyes searching for Shadow, and when their eyes met, she gave a shy little wave. Dan smiled, giving her a small nod. Shadow perked up, his tail wagging at the gesture. It was these small moments, unspoken but powerful, that reminded Dan why he did what he did. He had seen too many tragedies unfold, too many situations that didn't end like this. But tonight was different. Tonight, 20 lives had been saved because Shadow refused to back down. "Hey, Dan," Officer Ramirez called, walking toward him with a steaming cup of coffee in each hand. "Figured you could use this." He handed one to Dan, then took a seat on the car's rear bumper beside him. Dan accepted the cup gratefully, wrapping his hands around it to soak up the warmth. "Thanks. I think we all need about 5 of these after tonight." Ramirez took a long sip before nodding toward Shadow. "That dog of yours, he's something else. I've seen K9S do some impressive things, but this takes the cake." Dan glanced down at Shadow, who was now lying on his side, resting but still alert. "Yeah, he's one of a kind," Dan said quietly. "I don't know what I would have done without him tonight." "Neither do they," Ramirez added, gesturing to the group of survivors. "You should have seen their faces when they realized he was the reason we found them. That kind of loyalty. It's rare." Dan nodded, his mind flashing back to the moment they opened the door and found those terrified faces staring back at him. He couldn't shake the image, nor the thought of what might have happened if they'd been just a little too late. A few yards away, a paramedic approached the young man who had asked earlier how they were found. He was now sitting on the edge of an ambulance, his head bowed slightly as the paramedic wrapped a bandage around his wrist. Dan watched as the paramedic leaned in, speaking softly to him, and the young man nodded, wiping at his eyes. Dan sighed and took another sip of coffee. "You think they'll be okay?" he asked Ramirez, his voice low. Ramirez followed Dan's gaze and shrugged lightly. It'll take time. Something like this leaves a mark. But they'll heal. They've got a second chance now, thanks to Shadow. Dan nodded, letting the words settle in. Shadow had given them a second chance. Something that wasn't always guaranteed in their line of work. He couldn't help but feel a swell of pride. Not just in Shadow, but in the bond they shared. Lost in his thoughts, Dan didn't notice the reporter approaching again until she was standing right in front of him. Microphone raised. "Officer Dan, if you have a moment," she began, flashing a bright, professional smile. "We'd love to hear more about Shadow and what makes him so special. Our viewers are eager to know more about the hero dog who saved 20 lives tonight." Dan hesitated for a moment, glancing down at Shadow, who looked up at him with his usual calm, knowing eyes. "Well," Dan began, "I could talk about Shadow all night, but if I had to sum it up, he's not just a partner. He's family. He's the kind of dog who listens when no one else will. When he senses something's wrong, you trust him. And tonight, he didn't give up until those people were found." The reporter nodded enthusiastically. "Incredible. Has Shadow always had that kind of instinct?" Dan chuckled softly. "Always. From day one. He was a stray when we first met. Scrappy, stubborn, and way too smart for his own good. I guess that hasn't changed much." The reporter laughed, clearly delighted with the story. "A stray turned hero. That's quite the journey. Thank you for sharing, Officer Dan. And thank you, Shadow, for reminding us all of the difference one life can make." As the reporter moved on, Dan ran a hand down Shadow's back. "Looks like you're famous now," he said with a grin. "Hope it doesn't go to your head." Shadow huffed softly, resting his head on Dan's lap, clearly unimpressed with the attention. The night wore on, and slowly, the scene began to clear. Survivors were transported to the hospital for further evaluation, and the flashing lights of emergency vehicles faded one by one until only Dan and Shadow remained. The quiet felt strange after the chaos of the night, but it was a welcome reprieve. Dan stood, stretching his legs before glancing down at Shadow. "Come on, boy. Let's head home." They climbed into the patrol car, the familiar hum of the engine breaking the silence. Shadow curled up in the passenger seat, his eyes heavy with sleep, but still keeping a watchful eye on his surroundings. As they drove through the quiet streets, Dan couldn't help but replay the night's events in his mind. So many things could have gone wrong, so many ways it could have ended differently. But Shadow had been there, steady and determined, refusing to give up until he was heard. Dan reached over, his hand resting gently on Shadow's head. "I owe you one, buddy. You were right all along." Shadow leaned into the touch, his tail thumping softly against the seat. The drive home felt longer than usual, the weight of the night pressing down on Dan's shoulders. But as they pulled into the driveway and the familiar warmth of home washed over him, he felt a sense of peace he hadn't expected. Inside, Shadow immediately padded over to his favorite spot by the couch, curling up with a contented sigh. Dan stood for a moment, watching him, his heart full of gratitude and admiration for the dog who had once been a stray and was now a hero. Dan sat down beside him, leaning back against the couch. He knew there would be more nights like this. Nights filled with uncertainty, danger, and the unknown. But he also knew that as long as Shadow was by his side, they could face anything together. "You've got the best instincts, Shadow," Dan said softly, his eyes growing heavy. "And I'll always trust you, no matter what." Shadow blinked up at him, his eyes full of understanding, before closing them again. The room grew quiet, the soft hum of the heater the only sound. And for the first time in a long while, Dan felt truly at ease. Shadow had done more than save 20 lives tonight. He had reminded Dan of the strength found in loyalty, courage, and unwavering trust. And that was something he would never forget. The next morning, the sunlight filtered through the windows, casting a warm glow across the living room. Shadow stirred, his ears twitching as the sound of birds chirping outside broke the stillness of the house. Dan was already awake, sitting at the kitchen table with a steaming cup of coffee in hand. He looked up as Shadow padded into the room, his tail wagging lazily. "Morning, hero," Dan greeted, taking a sip from his mug. "Sleep well," Shadow yawned, stretching his front legs before trotting over to Dan's side. He nudged Dan's leg with his nose, his eyes bright and expectant. Dan chuckled. All right, breakfast coming right up." He set his coffee down and opened the cabinet, pulling out Shadow's food. As he filled the bowl, his mind wandered back to the events of the night before. The phone calls had started early. Officers, reporters, and even the mayor wanting to thank him and Shadow for their actions. Shadow wasn't just a hero in the eyes of those 20 survivors. He had become a symbol of hope and resilience for the entire community. Dan placed the bowl on the floor, watching as Shadow ate with gusto. "You deserve it," he said quietly. Every last bite. The morning passed in a blur of phone calls and interviews. Dan tried to take it all in stride, but the constant attention felt surreal. By noon, his phone buzzed again. It was Officer Ramirez. "Hey, Dan," Ramirez said, his tone warm and upbeat. "Just wanted to give you a heads up. The chief wants to recognize Shadow officially. There's going to be a ceremony at City Hall tomorrow." Dan raised an eyebrow. "A ceremony?" "Yeah, full honors. They're giving him a medal for bravery." Dan glanced at Shadow, who was lying in the sunbeam by the window, completely oblivious to the conversation. He shook his head with a smile. "You've got to be kidding me." "Nope," Ramirez replied, chuckling. "This is a big deal. You'll be there, right?" Dan hesitated for a moment. He'd never been one for public ceremonies. But this wasn't about him. This was about Shadow, the dog who had saved 20 lives without hesitation or question. "Yeah," Dan said finally. "We'll be there." The next day arrived quickly. Dan stood in front of the mirror, adjusting his uniform for the first time in months. He tugged at his collar, feeling a bit uncomfortable, then glanced down at Shadow, who was watching him with mild curiosity. "You ready for this?" Dan asked. "Because I'm pretty sure you're about to be the star of the show." Shadow wagged his tail as if to say, "Of course, I'm always ready." City Hall was bustling with activity when they arrived. Cameras flashed, reporters swarmed the steps, and a small crowd had gathered outside to catch a glimpse of the city's newest hero. Dan took a deep breath and stepped out of the car, Shadow trotting confidently beside him. The crowd erupted into applause, and Dan couldn't help but smile as Shadow soaked it all in. He had always been calm and steady, but today, there was a spark of excitement in his eyes. Inside, the mayor stood at the podium waiting for their arrival. As Dan and Shadow approached, the mayor extended a hand. "Officer Dan, it's an honor to have you and Shadow here today." "Thank you, sir," Dan replied, shaking his hand. The mayor turned to address the crowd. "Today, we gather to celebrate true heroism, the kind of bravery and instinct that saved 20 lives. Shadow is a reminder of the incredible bond between officers and their K-9 partners, and his actions have inspired us all." He reached for a small velvet box and opened it, revealing a gleaming medal. "Shadow, it is my honor to present you with this medal for bravery." Dan knelt beside Shadow as the mayor pinned the medal to his collar. The crowd erupted into cheers and applause, and for a moment, everything else faded away. All that mattered was the dog beside him, the dog who had been there through it all. Dan leaned in, his voice barely a whisper. "You earned this, buddy. Every bit of it." Shadow licked his face, his tail thumping happily against the floor. As the ceremony ended and the crowd began to disperse, people came forward to shake Dan's hand and pet Shadow. The little girl from the warehouse was among them, holding her mother's hand. She ran straight to Shadow, wrapping her arms around his neck. "Thank you, Shadow," she said softly. "You saved us." Dan watched the scene unfold, his heart full. Moments like these were rare, but they made everything worth it. Later that evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon and the house grew quiet once again, Dan sat on the porch with Shadow at his feet. The medal gleamed faintly in the fading light, a tangible reminder of everything they had been through. "You know," Dan said, scratching behind Shadow's ears, "you've got more medals than I do now." Shadow looked up at him, his eyes filled with the quiet wisdom that only dogs seem to possess. Dan smiled. You've always been the hero, though. I've just been lucky enough to be along for the ride. The wind rustled through the trees, carrying with it a sense of peace and closure. Dan leaned back, his hand resting on Shadow's back, and for the first time in a long while, he allowed himself to simply be still. Because in that moment, he knew that no matter what challenges lay ahead, they would face them together, just as they always had. Later that evening, the house was quiet once more. The weight of the day, with its cheers, speeches, and flashing cameras, seemed like a distant memory. Dan stood on the back porch, watching the stars blink to life one by one. Shadow sat beside him, his eyes fixed on the horizon as though he were still on duty, always watching, always ready. You know, Dan said with a chuckle, breaking the silence, I don't think I'll ever get used to the idea of you being famous. Shadow glanced up at him, his eyes calm and steady. If he cared about fame, it didn't show. Dan sank into the old rocking chair, letting it creak softly beneath him. The air was cool and smelled faintly of pine and freshly cut grass. He thought back to when he first met Shadow, just a scrappy stray who refused to be ignored. It had taken months to train him, months to earn his trust. But once they had found that rhythm, there was no turning back. Shadow became more than just a dog. He became Dan's most loyal partner and closest friend. And tonight, Shadow had reminded him once again why that bond was so special. You saved 20 people last night, Dan said softly, reaching down to scratch behind Shadow's ears. 20 lives, Shadow. Do you realize how incredible that is? Shadow wagged his tail gently, resting his head on Dan's knee. It was a simple gesture, but it spoke volumes. To him, it wasn't about recognition or medals. It was about doing what needed to be done, about protecting and serving in the only way he knew how. Dan stared out at the darkened sky, his thoughts drifting. He could still see the faces of those 20 people, each one filled with relief and gratitude. He thought about the little girl and her whispered thank you, the young man who had found strength again because of Shadow's persistence. The world could be unpredictable, often cruel, but it was in moments like these that Dan was reminded of the good that still existed, of the light that could be found even in the darkest places. Shadow nudged his knee again, this time more insistently. Dan smiled. All right, I get it. Enough with the deep thoughts, right? Time to focus on what's really important. He stood and stretched, giving Shadow a playful pat on the side. Come on, let's grab a treat. You've earned it. Inside, the house was warm and inviting. Dan rummaged through the kitchen, pulling out Shadow's favorite snack. Shadow followed closely, his tail wagging with renewed energy. As Dan handed him the treat, he knelt down, resting a hand on Shadow's collar where the new metal gleamed. No matter how many lives you save, you'll always just be my boy, my partner, my best friend. Shadow chewed happily, his eyes never leaving Dan's face. Dan sat on the floor beside him, the quiet settling around them like a blanket. He knew the world wouldn't slow down. There would always be another call, another challenge waiting for them. But for now, they had this moment, a rare pause in the chaos. And in that moment, everything was exactly as it should be.